Yeah, except for they get squished all the time on very short life expectancies. So there are some certain drawbacks there.
Not how long your life is.
Is this all? This is like YOLO.
Yeah.
Oh, that was funny. I'm cool with human. Let's talk homeostasis. Homeostasis. It's one of our big ideas. I don't know, we don't talk about these as often as we probably should, but these are the 4 ideas that we could come back to every single day with what we learn. And biological systems utilize free energy and molecular building blocks to grow, reproduce, and to maintain dynamic homeostasis. Okay, that's what we have to do. And so dynamic homeostasis just means a lot of things change in order for nothing to change. Okay, so I want you to think about this. Like, that doesn't even make sense, Mrs. Rogers. I need my body temperature to stay right around 98.6 degrees. Okay? I can get a little cooler than that or a little warmer than that, and it'll be okay. But remember, if I get too far off that mark, my enzymes denature, my proteins denature, things stop working. Not good. So, if I get too cold, what do? I shiver. Or, as a reasonable human being, I put on a sweater. Right? If I get too hot, what do? I sweat. As a reasonable human being, I do not become naked. But I might go with some lighter fabric, right? I might choose something different. Animals, of course, don't make these clothing choices, but they can go through the shivering and the sweating or the panting, just like humans can, right? And so your body goes through homeostasis all the time, and you may not even think about it. Might not even be something that you notice. An example of a situation where homeostasis is happening that you don't have to think about is blood sugar. And some people do have to think about blood sugar, people who are diabetics. But that's a situation where your body is best between 70 and 110 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. That's sugar, that's how much sugar should be in your blood. If you don't have enough, your cells are starved of glucose, which means they can't produce ATP. That's a problem. If you have too much, you actually can poison your blood. Having too much glucose in your body causes all kinds of massive skin issues. You can lose limbs. We call that diabetes. Too much glucose in your blood is very dangerous. And so what organ is controlling that? Yeah, your pancreas. Your pancreas is controlling that. Most of us don't have, unless somebody here is diabetic, and you maybe, and I just don't know, we don't have to think about it. Controlling our sugar. We have to eat. Got to be honest, that's not something I've ever forgotten to do. It's easy to remember. Okay. And as long as I eat, everything else takes care of itself. But there are individuals for whom that's not the case. Okay? People whose blood sugar has to be very closely monitored by pricking your finger, testing your blood, and if it's too low, you eat sugar. If it's too high, you inject insulin. Right? And these are problems that diabetics have to deal with, where for most of us, a lot of things are changing in our bodies so that that set point, that ideal, is maintained. Okay? That's dynamic homeostasis. A lot of things changing so that nothing changes. Our friend the ant over my shoulder here, oh, look at him. He's a desert ant. Okay? How hot does it get during the day? Probably. Very. How cold does it get at night? Probably. Very. Can we relate that back to properties of water? Oh, how?
There's no water there.
There's no water. One of the properties of water is to
It's like the environment.
moderate temperature. Remember we talked about why are the coasts. Yeah? Hannah, you are so expressive. So one of the properties of water is to moderate temperature, right? We talked about why the coasts tend to have more moderate climates, that all we have to do is move inland a couple of 100 miles away from those oceans, and we don't have those moderate temperatures anymore, right? So in a desert, we don't have the water. If we don't have the water, we don't have that benefit of moderating those changes in temperature. So our friend the ant there, does he make his own heat? Is he warm-blooded or cold-blooded? I'm going to give you new words for that in a second.
Cold-blooded.
Cold-blooded. Who are your warm-blooded friends? Mammals and one more.
Fish.
No, birds. Birds. No, not fish. Birds. Birds and mammals. Okay, everybody else is what we call cold-blooded. Now, that's kind of a misnomer. You know what misnomer means? Bad choice of word. Because our friend here lives in the desert, and so when it's 120 degrees outside, even though we would call him cold-blooded, he is probably actually quite hot. Would you agree that that's true? You'd agree? Yeah, cool. All right, so instead we're going to call them endotherms and ectotherms. Endo means what? Inside. Endo, inside. It's all right. We're learning today. You'll test later. Okay. Ecto means outside. Therm means heat or temperature. Heat or temperature. Endergonic or exergonic. We are on a roll. So that refers to energy. Inside energy, outside energy. The energy is released as heat. Okay, but endothermic and exothermic. Right? We can describe reactions in that way as well. What is the endotherm and the exotherm? Ectotherm is the source of the heat. So for me, my source of heat is where? Inside. So I'm an endotherm. For him, the source of heat is where? Outside. So he's an ectotherm. So how energetically expensive is it to be an endotherm? Very. So I'm going to think about this for a second. Fitbit, my favorite data collecting tool. When first it tells me that it is 9:30 in the morning on the 23rd. Then it tells me that I've taken 1.9 or 1,900 steps today, and I've burned 805 calories. 1,900 steps. All right, so 800 steps. All right, so here, this is what my Fitbit tells me right now. Okay. Now I go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week, depending on how ridiculous my week is. It's my least favorite thing in the world, but that's cool. I go, unlike you lovely young people who love to run, I loathe it, but I do it anyway because it's important. And I do my 3 miles, and I burn my 300 calories. And once I run my 3 miles at a pace that is more twice than what Brio Blue runs, we discussed that this morning during first period, I feel like death. I'm winded, I'm sweaty, I'm quite hot. Collapsing seems like a fine option for the next few minutes. All of these things are true. And yet, I've only burned 300 calories. How many steps did I take in that? It's about 2,000 steps in a mile, give or take. So this is 6,000 steps turns into 300 calories. Yet, so far today, I mean, I've been here, limited space, there's not a treadmill here for me. 1,900 steps is 805 calories. In fact, when I got out of bed this morning, I forgot to check it, but I'll check it tomorrow morning. When I got out of bed this morning, my guess is that the thing probably said like 400 or 500 calories. I am laying in bed. What's happening? My body is burning calories in order to do what? To keep me warm. So the difference, the discrepancy, 6,000 steps, movement is actually only contributing to a small amount of energy burn. Why do I go through so many calories? Because I'm an endotherm. Because most of my energy is being burned to keep me warm. That's where our energy for the most part goes. So it seems like it makes an awful lot of sense for me to be able to control my own body temperature, as opposed to our friends, the ectotherms, like our friend the ant. It's like I am the temperature of my surroundings with a few things I can do, but not a ton. But if you've ever had a pet reptile, how often do you feed them? Once a week, once every 2 weeks, kind of depends. In the summer, you feed them more than the winter. If you've ever had a pet lizard or a pet snake, you're like, oh, actually, that's true. Yeah. Why? Because the warmer you are, the more calories you're burning. The warmer you are, the more calories you're burning. So when we think about it evolutionarily, if food is scarce, what makes more sense? If you all the time, what is the more sensible way to get your energy, your heat? You need endotherm or an ectotherm? Probably an ectotherm, right? If food is plentiful, does it make more sense to be an endotherm or an ectotherm? An endotherm, right? And so we have to kind of balance out these demands, evolutionarily, as far as it's concerned. But it all comes back down to this issue of homeostasis. How are you able to control the situation in your own body in order to survive? Because it comes down to that as well. Does this make sense? Yeah. All right. So animals have incredibly diverse forms, but common challenges. Oh, and that's what we've just been discussing. Very diverse things, but we all have common challenges. We have to obtain nutrients and oxygen, fight off infection, produce offspring. These are the things that animals need to be able to do. An organism's form, is anatomy, is closely related to its function, which is physiology. Okay? So if you ever take anatomy and physiology, this is what its form is anatomy. Okay, function is physiology. That means. So today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about feedback loops, like with the glucose. When it gets too high, what happens? When it gets too low, what happens? Feedback loops. We have to be able to control both the too high and the too low. I want to start by talking about something called lymph. Okay. Lymph is a clear fluid that bathes all of the cells in your body. And you might be going, I'm pretty sure that's blood, Mrs. Rogers. I think you missed the boat. Well, no. Okay, if you've ever been sick, and I'm sure we all have at some point, you've been to the doctor, what's the first thing he does? He goes right here, right? He is feeling what we call your lymph nodes. Okay, your lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are these tiny, they're not tiny, but they're not very big, those small structures in your body that filter your lymph fluid. Your lymph fluid is an immune fluid that bathes all of your cells, and we'll learn a lot about it when we get to our immune system. But what he's doing is that when your immune system is working overtime, your lymph nodes get swollen, and so he's feeling to see how sick are you. And if they're super, super, super swollen, that's when we get to kind of do blood work and these sorts of things get done. And if they're not super swollen, he's like, well, you probably have a cold. I'm really sorry. Here's some codeine. Have a good day. Right? But that's what he's feeling for. How come you don't ever see lymph? I mean, I guarantee you when I slice my hand open, the stuff that comes out is not clear. So where does the lymph go? Because our blood is actually contained in vessels, right? Veins and capillaries. It turns out when you cut yourself, your veins will almost instantly become very porous and release their blood as an immune response. And it mixes with your lymph. So your blood looks, or the fluid looks just like blood, but it's because the lymph was clear. Fair enough? So we have this lymph. The lymph is actually plays a huge role in controlling homeostasis in organisms. These systems help keep the internal environment stable, even if the external environment is variable, and we call that dynamic homeostasis. Processes change in order to keep the internal environment constant. Your cells are organized hierarchically. Cells are organized into tissues, tissues are organized into organs, and they might work together in groups to make up what we call an organ system. So skin, for example, is an organ of the integumentary system, protects against infection, and helps regulate body temperature. We like our skin a lot. It's very handy to have. So there are two new words that I want you guys to be aware of. We have regulators and we have conformers. Regulators are things that when faced with an environmental fluctuation, the graph here is showing you temperature, that would manage their internal environment by changing things internally in the face of external changes. Alternatively, a conformer will just allow the change to occur. Okay? So in this case, we're looking at an otter and a fish. This is a mammal, so we're not going to call it an endotherm, just like us. A fish is our ectotherm. Those are our two new words. When we look at our endotherm, you'll notice that this ambient temperature, ambient means temperature outside. Okay, it's just immediately surrounding me. So right now our ambient temperature in L306 is about, 67 degrees. So our ambient environmental temperature, as it changes from nearly freezing to quite hot, our river otter, our endotherm, as a regulator, stays the same. Because he's going to burn more calories and produce more heat so that that is maintained. So he is a regulator. Our largemouth bass, on the other hand, is a conformer, which means as the lake is cold in the winter, warm in the summer, our temperature increases as well. Okay, so our temperature goes up here, temperature goes up here. Okay, it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, almost exactly the same. A little fluctuation, but more or less the same. Now, just because our friend the bass is a temperature conformer, it doesn't mean he's a conformer when it comes to all things. For example, let's think about a freshwater fish, such as the largemouth bass. Does he have cell walls on his cells? He's a fish, so no, right? Plants have cell walls, fungus have cell walls. Like, we'll review that when we get to review quiz 4. Okay, so plants have cell walls, animals don't. He lives in freshwater. Boy, didn't we just have an FRQ about this? So, he lives in freshwater. Where's the water going to want to go? Inside of him. So if the water goes inside of him, is he going to blow up like a pufferfish and pop? Probably not. Never seen a bass blown up like a pufferfish. So what does he have to do? Is he going to regulate or conform? He's going to regulate. So he's going to have some kinds of systems in order to modify the fluids that are coming in or prevent fluids from coming in so that he can not blow up like a balloon. Turns out with freshwater fish, what they do is they produce so much urine that they are constantly peeing. Freshwater fish don't ever stop peeing. Who knew? That's what they do. So they don't blow up like a balloon. So just because they are conformers in one way doesn't mean they're conformers in all ways. That fish is going to regulate his water uptake in order to make sure that he doesn't pop. Okay. So here's an easy example of, we call these antagonistic negative feedback loops. Okay. In English class, who is an antagonist? The bad guy. We call him the bad guy, but he's really just the person that's working opposite of the main guy, right? So we call him the bad dude, but he's got his own motivations, and maybe it's a girl. We shouldn't always say the guys are the bad guys, right? So in this case, they're antagonistic, meaning they work opposite of each other. So we're going to start with an example with one out of your house. Heater and air conditioner. So you set the thermostat, let's call it 70 for a nice even temperature. Call it 70. In the winter, it gets cold, what happens? Heater turns on. What does the heater do? Heats the house. When the house gets warm enough, what does the heater do? Stops. So the stimulus in this situation is the house got cold. It caused something to happen. What did it cause to happen? It caused the heater to turn on. When the heater turned on, it reduced the stimulus. Okay? So it got cold, and then the heater warmed it up. Right? Well, in the summer, we're still at 70 degrees. It gets pretty hot outside. So what happens? The air conditioner turns on to cool down the house, and when it gets cool enough, the air conditioner turns back off, right? So the air conditioner and the furnace are antagonistic to one another. They work oppositely to achieve the same goal. Do they both have the same goal? Yeah. The same goal is 70 degrees. Okay? But they work in opposite ways to make sure that that is maintained. You do the same thing in several different ways we'll talk about here in a second. Okay, we got through all that. So, what do you maintain homeostasis for? Temperature. Okay. Blood pH. If you move more than 0.1 unit off of 7.4, you are dead. Can't do it. Okay, 7.4 is your number. Blood glucose level is one we'll talk about as well. That's where diabetes comes into play. You have a pretty wide range for blood glucose level, 70 to 110. But this can spike into the 200s or 300s if a diabetic eats something that is got a lot of glucose in it, got a lot of sugar in it. Okay, it can spike pretty high. Homeostasis in animals relies on what we call negative feedback. You guys remember negative feedback? We talked about enzymes and producing things. We said, okay, if we don't have enough of the output, then we go through this process of producing more of that particular amino acid or macromolecule or whatever it is we're making. But once we have enough of that, the gene regulation says, okay, now we're going to turn it off because we don't need to be wasting our energy. Remember, that was negative feedback. Okay, this works under negative feedback also. And so the mechanism that reduces the stimulus ultimately air conditioner and the heater. The set point is whatever target we're trying to achieve. And while the set points for homeostasis are stable, sometimes they change. Sometimes they move. When you have a fever, we'll talk about this when we get to the immune system in a couple of lectures. When you have a fever, it turns out that your set point in your hypothalamus has moved it. It's not that your homeostasis is broken. Your homeostasis is still working just fine. But what's happened is instead of your set point being 98.6 degrees, your hypothalamus resets it to about 101. Why would your body do that? Your body would do that to kill off whatever's making you sick, to slow down that process. Most times homeostasis is maintained through negative feedback loops. Okay. Why? The action reduces the stimulus. But there's also positive feedback loops as well, but they don't usually function in homeostasis. Okay. Usually the positive feedback loops exist to complete the task. We talked about these a little bit back in unit or in semester 1. But we talked about labor hormones in childbirth, okay, where hormones are produced to begin labor. But the process of labor causes more hormones to be produced, which makes labor more intense. And that's why labor starts off slow. You have some time to get to the hospital, but then it gets more and more and more intense until ultimately the task of childbirth is completed. But the amount of time this takes is different for different women. And that's why there are some women who can go through labor and have a baby in a couple of hours, and others will labor for days. And that's just, there's no way to know until there you are. But that's why there's a difference there. So different people can go through it at different rates. Nursing and infant is another one. The task to be completed is feed the baby who's screaming at you. But again, it's a positive feedback loop. The baby cries. Females produce the hormone that causes milk to be produced. The milk feeds the baby, and we keep doing this. The feeding of the baby stimulates more hormones, which stimulates more milk, and this keeps happening until you stop feeding the baby and the baby stops crying. So, we're going to first look at thermoregulation as an example of homeostasis. Thermoregulation is where animals maintain an internal temperature within a particular range. Being outside is a problem because of things like, we talked about this back in the fall also, efficiency of enzymatic reactions. Okay? You could alter the fluidity of cell membranes. Remember that in cold temperatures, your cell membranes get kind of tight, less fluid. Too warm, the cell membranes can literally disintegrate, right? Because the kinetic energy between those molecules becomes too high. Other temperature-sensitive processes, but that heat can come from internal metabolism or the external environment. So our endotherms, here's our friend the walrus. Okay. Endotherms are warmed mostly by heat generated by metabolism. If you're going to live in the Arctic, you also get a pretty healthy layer of blubber, to be honest, useful. They can both heat and cool themselves as necessary. In contrast to ectotherms, get their heat from external sources, and have to adjust body temperature through behavior. What does that mean? Basking. Okay, especially in the next, well, it's been so warm lately, so probably now, if you go hiking, the chances of you coming across lizards and snakes on the trail, basking is pretty normal. This is why if you ever go rock climbing, you don't ever reach up to grab a rock, because if there's a snake up on that rock, basking, that's not going to end well for you. Right? So you always look where you're placing your hands when you're out, on the trails, out in the parks and whatnot. So this is pretty limiting because you, as a lizard, are entirely dependent on the environment for your energy. And it seems like that wouldn't work out, right? That at some point there's going to be a snowstorm and you're done. Well, it takes far fewer calories to live, so it's a pretty good strategy if food's limited. Okay? It's a very good strategy. So, this is a little flashback to 9th grade physical science if you took that class instead of chemistry. But an organism can exchange heat by 4 physical processes: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Radiation is easy. The sun makes you hot. We can all agree that that's true, I think. And evaporation is only heat loss. You can't gain heat by evaporation. It's not possible. But evaporation is the removal of heat from the surface of a liquid that's losing some of its molecules as gas. This is why sweating helps cool you down. Sweating doesn't help cool you down because it's wet, because you're wet now. Okay? Sweating helps cool you down because now the surface of your body is wet, but the heat from your body can be absorbed into those liquid molecules and excite them, and then they depart as a gas. And so evaporation, evaporative water loss is actually what helps you cool down when you sweat. This is why in places that are really humid, where your sweat doesn't actually evaporate, it feels so much hotter. And in Colorado, it feels so much not as hot, I guess. Cooler is maybe not the right word. But when it's 100 degrees in Colorado, I can go sit on my back patio in the shade and have a glass of iced tea, and it would be okay. My parents' house in South Texas, if it's 100 degrees, all you do is stand in front of the air conditioning vent. Sometimes you watch TV while you do it, but this is all we do. Why do you live here? And presumably you adapt, but not me. I just leave. I go back to a place where the climate is agreeable. Convection. Convection is the transfer of heat by the movement of a fluid past a surface. Quick point, fluid is both a liquid and a gas. Okay, we often think of fluids just as liquids. Gases are also fluids, things that flow. Okay, but I want you to think about if you look at the thermos or the temperature outside, and it says, oh, it's 52 degrees. It's a great day for a walk. Let's go for a walk. 52 degrees means two very different things when there's wind versus not wind. When it's windy outside and it's 52 degrees, I'm going to need about 6 hats, 3 pairs of mittens, and probably a scarf. If it's that same temperature but no wind, probably don't even need a jacket. Right? That's convection. Convection is literally pushing the heat away from you. So it feels really cold, even though the actual temperature of the outside world is the same. We probably all experience that. Conduction, the direct transfer of heat between two molecules of object in contact with each other. Conduction. So this is heating a pot of water on the stove if you have like a glass top cooktop, right? Physically touching each other, one hot thing is going to heat up another thing. Okay. Lots of other adaptations can enhance thermal regulation in animals. Mammals and birds have insulation, fur, feathers, and fat. Okay. That helps reduce the flow of heat between the animal's body and its environment. You can also raise your fur or feathers to trap in a thicker layer of air to have almost like a blanket. Birds is a great example of this. Next time we have a snowstorm, which at this point seems like maybe next year, but we'll see. Next time we have a snowstorm, pay attention to the little brown birds that are flying around after the snow stops falling. They look like tennis balls, right? There is nothing aerodynamic about that shape. But it's like, how is this possible? Same little brown birds that you have in the summer when there are these sleek little dudes that dive bomb things, right? How is that? Well, it's because what they can do is literally take their feathers and stand them up and create a thicker layer of insulation around themselves. You have an evolutionary relic of that as well. Goosebumps. You may have some now because you're in science and we forget to heat the rooms here. But if you look, next time you have goosebumps, I want you to notice what's happening to your hair. Every one of your hairs is attached to a tiny muscle. And when you get goosebumps, that tiny muscle contracts. So the hair that normally is like this, the muscle actually attaches on this side, this contracts and it goes like this. So what ends up happening is now, when your hair lay flat, you have a very thin blanket of insulation, but when they stand up, you have a very thick blanket. Now, we're not very hairy, most of us, anymore. So it doesn't actually help keep us warm, but you can imagine that if you were a furry beast, that might work out, right? It might actually help keep you warm just by standing up those hairs on your head. You can also change blood flow. Okay, you can also change blood flow. What does it mean to dilate? When you get your eyes dilated, what happens to your pupils? They get big and you get a migraine because there's got too much light coming in, and you get the fancy sunglasses that don't have any arms, right? They just like attached to your face. Okay, it's a good time. If you're me, you just like sit there for 2 hours because I'm not driving a car like that. So dilation means you get big. Vaso is vein. Vasodilation opens blood vessels near the body surface, allowing heat to be dispersed to the environment. So when you're hot, you ever notice how you get pink? You get pink when you're warm? It's because you are dilating all of these blood vessels, and that's allowing the heat to dissipate. Okay. Constriction is opposite. When you get cold, your fingers get even colder, right? The first thing to get cold on me is my hands and my toes. Why is that true? Because they constrict, my blood vessels constrict, keeping my blood inside to help keep me warm, and not a lot's going to my extremities. Okay? Vasoconstriction and vasodilation. Behaviorally, animals can pant or sweat to increase heat loss by evaporation, burrow or sun themselves to increase or reduce exposure to radiation, okay? And ultimately, these animals can make it through. Some animals can use what's called countercurrent exchange to reduce heat loss. Here's how countercurrent exchange works. You might have thought about this: ducks and geese swimming in water that has chunks of ice in it, and their little feet don't snap off. Like, it seems to me they freeze straight through and crack off like the end of a cookie. No, fine. So here's what happens. He's warm. His feet don't need to be. They just need blood flow. Why do we need blood flow? Because it's going to deliver oxygen, take away CO2, and all the other, deliver ATP, right? All these other things. Or deliver glucose, rather, to make ATP. So as the blood leaves his feet, okay, it goes down and then back up. This will warm the blood that is leaving the foot, actually heats up the blood that is returning to his body. So that when the blood goes back into his body, it is almost the same temperature as the blood that's leaving. Why? Because here, the 35-degree blood gives a little bit of energy to the 33-degree blood, gets a little bit. The 30 gives a little bit of energy to the 27, the 20 gives a little bit of energy to the 18. So instead of losing all of this heat to the freezing water, it loses the heat to the blood that's coming back up into the organism. Called countercurrent exchange. Counter meaning opposite currents, because this is going down and this is going up, and they're exchanging some energy. In humans and other mammals, regulation of temperature is based on feedback mechanisms. So you have a region of your brain called the hypothalamus. It does a lot of different things in your body, but one of the things it does is it keeps track of your temperature, and it can tweak what happens in your body as a result of what it detects. And so within the hypothalamus, it's actually a group of nerve cells that function as your body's thermostat, and they respond to body temperatures outside of the normal range by activating mechanisms. So what are those mechanisms? Well, homeostasis, your goal is about 36 to 38 degrees Celsius. Okay? If you're too hot, your hypothalamus detects it. That's how it causes you to sweat and have vasodilation. That causes you to cool down, and you return to normal. If you are too cold, your hypothalamus detects it, causes your blood vessels to constrict, causes you to shiver, your body temperature goes up, and you've returned to normal. Two antagonistic negative feedback loops. Loops we don't think about. These are things that just happen, but our brain is detecting what's happening in our body and causing it to respond appropriately. Okay. Does this make sense? So far, you think, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Been there, done that. So let's make it a little bit more complicated and start talking about the endocrine system. To maintain homeostasis, the tissues, organs, and the organ systems have to work together. This is achieved through two different systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, and both contribute to homeostasis. You may recognize this diagram. It's one we saw in the fall. And here we have the hormone, so endocrine cell, and this is your nerve cell. And these are cells that are responding to an environmental change. So they received a stimulus, the endocrine cell, through exocytosis, dumps all these hormones into this is your lymph, right? Because the blood is contained in vessels, but the lymph just gets to go wherever it wants. It gets to ooze. Okay? Goes into our blood vessel. Anything that's in our blood travels to our entire body. We can't put something into our blood and say, hey, blood, can you only go to my nose? That's not how it works. So blood goes through your whole body. So it gets pumped everywhere. So that hormone that went into the blood is also everywhere. And these hormones try to attach to different cells in your body. But the only cells that they can attach to are the ones that have the proper surface protein to match the shape. Remember that from the first semester? Yeah. The cells that don't have the proper surface protein can't detect the hormone and don't respond to it. And that's fine, they're not supposed to. But the target cells have the proper receptor, and those target cells then generate a response. How long do you think this takes? Is this super quick or super slow? This is slow. It can be on the order of minutes, but it's not on the order of milliseconds. Okay? And it can last a really long time, like puberty. gears, right? Nervous system. Here's your fast response. Okay, here's your fast response. Nervous system, there's a stimulus, and that stimulus could be anything. Okay? It could be the light. I was driving down the road and the light changed from yellow to red. That's a stimulus. So what happens when there's a stimulus? We see something, the cells communicate to one another to cause some sort of response. Now, oftentimes the nervous system has to communicate with other systems. If I see that the light has changed on the stoplight in front of me, I need to probably remove my foot from the gas pedal and place it on the brake. Probably a wise plan. Well, what system is going to be responsible for that? My muscular system. My muscles are going to have to control my foot and tell it to do something. So very often the nervous system itself then has to communicate with a different system in order to do this response down here. We will spend, I believe, 3 whole lectures doing nervous system stuff. So if this is a little vague to you right now, that's okay. What I do need you to know, though, is that the amount of time this takes is on the order of minutes to hours to years. And the amount of time this takes can be seemingly instantaneous. Okay? Very fast. Nervous system responses are very fast. But they don't last very long. Right? It's a quick and short. So here's an example of an endocrine pathway that can control the pH of blood. This is a big deal because, again, if we move more than 0.1 units, then we are in trouble. Endocrine cells respond directly to a stimulus by producing a hormone. So this is a negative feedback loop. The stimulus in this case was a drop of the pH. We actually detect this in a part of your intestine. If that's the case, the endocrine cell releases a hormone. The endocrine cells are actually in the place of detection. Releases a hormone, goes through your blood, goes to the target cells. It turns out in this case the target cells are also the pancreas. Pancreas does a lot of things aside from controlling insulin and glucagon, blood sugar. Pancreas releases something called bicarbonate. Bicarbonate's a buffer. Remember that word from the fall? Hannah just keeps laughing back there. Come on, buffer, chemistry. Chemistry, what does a buffer do? Resists changes in pH. So the bicarbonate release, this is bicarbonate down here, that's this right here. If the pH is too high, bicarbonate dissociates into this, okay, which will absorb the extra or the H pluses. If the pH is too low, we go this way, and we donate those hydrogen ions in order to increase our pH. Okay, so we release bicarbonate in order to buffer any changes that we might have there. We detect that in the intestine, and then your hormones will respond appropriately. Okay? Thanks, guys. That's handy. It's another thing we don't think about. A lot of things change so that nothing changes, and we don't have to think about it. Neuroendocrine pathways are hormone pathways that respond to stimuli from the external environment. So detecting your environment is always your nervous system. Your nervous system is always responsible for detecting your environment. But there are different systems that work with your nervous system in order to respond to your environment. So think about, how do you detect your environment? You see things, you smell things, you touch things, you taste things. These are nervous system things, right? We're detecting what's going on around us. So sometimes we'll rely on the nervous system to detect the stimulus in the first place, but then we'll use hormones to execute the particular response. So in this case, we're looking at a positive feedback loop. This is breastfeeding. The stimulus, your baby is hungry. That stimulus causes the endocrine system here to release the hormone. The hormone goes into the blood system. This takes a few minutes to get going, but once it gets going, it is a longer lasting response than just the nervous system, which is detect. Right? So this part is the detecting, and the part down here is the responding. So we use endocrine glands to respond, just like with my flat or my stoplight example, we use the muscle system to respond. So sometimes we have to use other systems to respond. Keep in mind, hormones have to go through the whole body. So if they're in the blood, they're going all over the place. The only cells that respond to hormones are the ones that have the particular receptor for the hormone. Some of the hormones are water soluble, some of them are fat soluble. So we learned about that before, hydrophilic, hydrophobic. We were talking about the different kinds of macromolecules back in Unit 1. If they're water-soluble hormones, They cannot make it through the plasma membrane because there's that lipid bilayer. They bind to the cell surface receptors on the external portion of a cell and trigger events on the inside. We talked about that also back in Unit 2. When we were talking about cells, we had the signal reception, signal transduction, signal response. Cell signaling is what we're talking about here. So that's very fuzzy to you. You might want to do that particular review video sooner than later. Okay. Other hormones are fat-soluble. These hormones pass through the membrane. Okay, things that are fat-soluble can make it through the membrane. Receptors for these hormones are in the cytosol, so they're intracellular rather than extracellular. This diagram I'm actually not a huge fan of, but I'm gonna use it. I'm gonna tell you how, if I were the author, I would have tweaked it. So water-soluble hormones are produced in this is gonna be your endocrine cell. Here we have through exocytosis here, okay, water-soluble hormones being produced, and they can go anywhere they want. Turns out your veins are fairly porous, so this is not bound by a cell membrane. Okay, lots of cells make up your veins, and they're fairly porous, they can get in. So they travel all the way through your body, but they can't make it through the cell membrane here. So our water-soluble hormones attach to a transmembrane protein. You guys remember me talking about these? Okay, so here, signal reception, transduction, and then some kind of a response. That response is probably some kind of gene regulation, producing a protein, activating an enzyme, something of those natures, right? If your fat-soluble hormone, see this is what part I don't like is right here. Fat-soluble hormones are free to leave the cell because they can get through the lipid bilayer, but your lymph is water-soluble, and so they can't exist in the lymph by themselves. They have transport proteins, think of them like a babysitter, something that's like, okay, I'm going to attach to you so that you're not fat-soluble even though you are fat-soluble. And it needs its transport proteins up here in the lymph also. Okay, I would add this little purple babysitter up here also. And so the transport proteins keep them from kind of coagulating in your lymph and in your blood. But then when we get to the cell, the transport protein literally can push it through the cell membrane, and it can be transferred via endocytosis in a vesicle or something like that, all the way into the inside portion of the nucleus. And so these fat-soluble hormones tend to actually go all the way into a cell, whereas the water-soluble ones tend to stay outside of a cell. Lots of hormones have more than one kind of response. Epinephrine is an example. That's adrenaline. Epinephrine raises blood glucose, increases blood flow to the muscles, and decreases blood flow to the digestive system. So adrenaline is one of those super powerful things. It's your fight or flight hormone. Okay? Something horrifying has happened, and like you oversleep. You ever notice when you oversleep and you look at your alarm, you're like, oh, are you going to have breakfast? No. And are you even going to think about it? Probably not. You're not even hungry. Why aren't you hungry? Because of epinephrine. Okay? You don't even think about it because you are in fight or flight mode. Probably in this case, flight. Whoa, going to biology. Okay? So what happens? Instantly, nearly instantly, epinephrine floods your body. And if it's flooding your body, all of your cells are exposed to epinephrine. The question is whether or not your cells respond to epinephrine. That's dictated by the kind of cell surface protein that may or may not be present. And then what kind of surface protein detects it will tell the cell what to do. So in this case, in your liver cells, liver is where that glucose comes from, the epinephrine attaches, glycogen deposits that are in the liver are released, and a lot of glucose is released instantly. Your blood sugar spikes, and you are ready to fight or flight. The trick is if you're fighting or flighting, you're not really interested in sending a lot of blood to your intestines to help you digest your food, because we're fighting or flighting, and that's not necessary. However, you would like your skeletal muscles to be at the ready, right? So if you can think of a time when you have had a lot of adrenaline in your body, maybe before an athletic event, or maybe before you're like a debate, or something like that, where you're like, okay, on the ready, gotta focus, gotta focus, gotta focus. You don't ever go, I'm gonna need a snack. That's not what we do. Amy's like, me, always hungry, always hungry. And the difference between whether they dilate or constrict, okay, so this one's dilated, this one's constricted, is the type of receptor. So a different receptor can cause a totally different response. And the same receptor here on a different cell, same receptor here and here, but because it's on a different cell, different signal transduction pathway, different response. Okay? So any of the different aspects of that can be tweaked based on what's happening intracellularly. One more example I want to give you of this, mostly because I think it makes a lot of sense, is with digestion. When you take in more energy-rich molecules than you need for metabolism, you store the extra energy. We store it as fat. It's kind of annoying. I wish I could eat pizza and chocolate every day. That's just not how it works. The first places that the extra energy go are to liver and muscle cells. Okay? They are storing energy as glycogen. No matter how you eat it, if you eat too many calories, be it fat, carbs, or proteins, it all gets stored as glycogen. All of it. Once those stores are full, additional excess is stored as fat and adipose cells. Okay? So the first place extra energy goes is your liver and your muscle. When you don't have enough calories taken in that your body is using, the first thing we do is use the liver glycogen, and then you go to the muscle glycogen, and the very last place they go is fat. Those are the order that those stores of energy are tapped into. But that synthesis and the breakdown of glycogen is central to this process. If I read a food label, it never says included glycogen. That's not there. Sometimes it'll say glucose or high fructose corn syrup or something like that, but it doesn't say glycogen. Your body has to turn that extra energy into glycogen in order for you to store it. So tissues throughout the body are relying on ATP, but that starting molecule is glucose. So you take things in, not as glycogen, you turn them into glycogen to store them, but then you have to turn them into glucose in order to use them. So there's a lot of chemical reactions that are going on here in order for you to keep things in balance. And our pancreatic hormones that are insulin and glucagon are regulating this glucose homeostasis by regulating the synthesis and the breakdown of glycogen, which is that intermediate molecule. They work opposite each other, so we call them an antagonistic hormone pair. Okay, those are our words from earlier. So glucagon is secreted by alpha cells in the pancreas. Insulin is secreted by beta cells in the pancreas. Glucagon is released when glucose is too high, stimulates the release of glycogen from the liver, so your glucose levels go up. Insulin is secreted when blood glucose is too high, causes your glucose levels to go down. Still a negative feedback loop. For reasons that are unclear to me, you need to know which one comes from alpha cells and which one comes from beta cells. So let's give you a quick trick to remember this, shall we? They're alphabetical. G comes before I, G-H-I, alpha, beta, also alphabetical. Got it? I don't know why you have to know that, but you do. So, let's put a diagram with it. So here's our goal, right? This is what our thermostat is set at. We have a pretty wide range. But if you just ate lunch, and maybe your lunch consisted of a cookie, some Starburst, and some sweet tea, well, we just spiked well beyond that. So your blood glucose spikes, insulin is produced, extra glucose is stored as glycogen here. If this is full, your liver is full, then we're going to turn it into fat in our lipid cells. Or lipids in our fat cells, rather. Put that backwards. If this is too low, so you overslept, you fight or flighted your way straight to biology without breakfast, you're here, the adrenaline is starting to pass, and then, oh my gosh, I'm so hungry because I haven't eaten since 6 o'clock yesterday, and now it's 10:15. Hungry, your pancreas releases glucagon, okay? It's going to cause the liver to release the glycogen. As this gets depleted, it is replenished from fat cells, okay? Or you eat, either one. So you have to deplenish this of your glycogen before your body will start digging into fat cells. That's how that whole process works. Okay? But again, 2 negative feedback loops. I just want to talk very briefly about what diabetes is. It's an autoimmune disorder where the alpha, or rather the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed. The cells can reproduce themselves, except for that then the new ones are also destroyed. Okay, so autoimmune is a self-immune issue, and that means that your immune system is attacking cells that it should not. Some of you probably know somebody with diabetes even if you don't realize it. Okay? In essence, what happens is that insulin is either not produced, that's type 1 diabetes, where you don't have the cells that make them, or in type 2 diabetes, your body cells are not sensitive to insulin. We tend to associate type 2 diabetes with overweight people who don't exercise and have really bad diets. Okay? That is absolutely a lie. My sister, who has never been weighed more than 130 pounds, unless she was pregnant, has type 2 diabetes. Why? Who knows? Just is. So every year when I go get checked, I have to have my glucose checked because what are the chances of me getting it? Probably higher. Every year it looks fine. But it just turns up, right? It just turns up that your cells stop being responsive. There's no cure to either one of them. But to treat type 1 diabetes, you inject with insulin, right? Because that's what your cells can't produce. So you take your blood sugar, you see how much glucose you have based on your body weight, tells you how much insulin you have to inject to get your numbers to go down. If your blood glucose is too low, then you eat something sweet to get it back up. Down here, because your cells are not as responsive to insulin, they try to control that with diet. Literally, for my sister, if it has any kind of os in it that's not natural, she can't eat it. So if you look at barbecue sauce is a killer. Tons of sugar in barbecue sauce. And you have to read all of these packaging that trying to get you to not have sugar so that when you have natural sugars, your bodies will respond, and then they will give her extra insulin so that her body at this point will still respond when she's flooded with more insulin. So extra insulin will get her cells to respond so long as it doesn't happen very long. So there's actually insulin pills that they'll take. But it's not something that has just to do with, well, you ate donuts every day, every meal for 12 years, and now this is the consequence you face. Now, are there some people for whom that is true? Yes, but it's not nearly as common as we think. How do we diagnose it? Well, type 1 diabetes is a dipstick. People who have diabetes urinate glucose because there's so much glucose in their blood that as you produce urine, there's more glucose in your urine. And so at some point in your youth, when you went in for a physical, they made you pee in a cup, and they just have a little piece of paper, kind of like that PTC paper I gave you guys. It's a dipstick, and if it turns, the ones I've seen are blue, if it turns blue, you've got glucose in your urine. Now we do blood tests, and we start running tests to see what's going on. If it comes out glucose-free, no problem. You're good to go. Okay? So they test you for glucose. People with diabetes produce a crazy amount of urine because of osmoregulation. There's too much glucose in your blood. You add water, you add water, you add water. So one of the things that they watch for to see, usually type 1 diabetes pops up when kids are little, like elementary school. They'll look for kids who have to pee all the time. And if that starts, we see that kind of like every 30 minutes, I have to go to the bathroom, I have to go to the bathroom. That's usually when they'll test you because that's one of the possible behavioral changes that can be associated with it. It could also be that you're drinking a lot of water. Okay, but that's when they'll start to test you. All right, let's talk about